I think there's a critical link between finance and sales operations. And in some companies, depending on the size, finance is doing some operations tasks. Tom, thanks for having me. I'm, excited to be here and always kind of fun. And, I'm passionate about sales operations and finance. I've said on LinkedIn, I post a lot about, FP&A and finance. One of the things I said is we should always look to work in other areas in the business. And I said, if there's another area I was going to go into, it'd be sales operations. I really enjoyed that sales world. And I think there's a critical link between finance and sales operations. And in some companies, depending on the size, finance is doing some operations tasks. Yeah. Like, often you'll see some companies where sales commissions sit in finance, developing the plans. Sometimes it sits in the, that operations world. Sometimes it sits with sales. I was lucky to work at an org where a lot of that did for quite a while sit with finance. And so, that I think working together, it's key. Finance obviously in many ways holds the purse string, right? The dollars that everybody spends. Yeah. And sales is the one that if they're not generating revenue, there's not dollars to spend at the end of the day. So I look at it as critical that the two work together, whether it be, around sales commissions and aligning, understanding revenue, understanding, what the cost to acquire a customer is, just so many things that, operations is looking at and tracking how many salespeople we need, what we'll allow to hire, what are the company's goals, and how do we work together to get there? I've seen both situations in orgs where there was very little sales operations function. A lot of it fell on finance. And I've seen ones where there's a very healthy sales operations and there was a high level of coordination. And I think the second generally I've found works better. Where there's really, you have those experts that really understand sales operations, and you have finance partnering with them and working together to figure out what's the, what are the right metrics to be tracking? What are the right, incentives to make sure the salespeople, what should those hiring plans be looking at? And having that finance perspective to make sure we're maximizing the bottom line. Because sales so often, the focus is always push, grow, get revenue. But if you're not careful, there can be times where you're getting unprofitable and unhealthy revenue growth, right? And I think finance can help gate that and make sure that we don't get in that situation where you look back in a year, oh yeah, we grew 12%, but we grew expense 15%, and we're a fairly mature business. This is a really bad thing, right? If you're in hyper growth, it's different, and you have the cash. You're often spending more than you're generating. And so, having somebody that really, their job is to look at that side of things that can coordinate and work with you is really important in my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, we're talking about the overall efficiency of a business, and people in finance have a great insight into this. Now, you're speaking about something there, which is basically when a closed-won signature happens, there's something that happens before that stuff hits finance. And I'm be really interested to hear some great examples of how finance have worked with sales teams and ops to bridge that piece and bring visibility into that area.
Yeah, so a few things. So let's take one example. Right before the closed one, I've seen where there's review processes, right? Typically sales are given some kind of authority. And again, it depends on industry, but let's say, MSRP on something is $100. Yeah. Sales might have the authority to discount it down to $95 a month. Yeah. And beyond that, they need finance. An example of discipline, I worked in an organization when I first came over, anything over a certain percentage I had to review and sign off for sales. But what was happening is the process was sales was already sharing the contract with the customer, and in many cases had signature. Then they were asking me to approve it. And if I didn't approve it, it's like, well, we already told the customer this price. Well, what do you do at that point? You don't want to, make your whole brand look bad by reneging on a price that's already been promised. And so, situations like that, like one of the things we did is said, look, we're going to change the process. You can't share the contract with the customer if it's outside this range without getting finance approval. Okay. And so that was an example of something I saw where we had to work together. And at first, nobody in finance or in sales liked me. They weren't happy because they were used to being able to do whatever they wanted. And it wasn't that I wasn't flexible, but they got to the point where they'd call me and we talk about it. Hey, I have this deal. What can I do? How can we make it work? They don't want to pay up fronts, which we usually will charge. Can I do this? And so I'd look at it and look at margins. And there were a few times where I had to tell somebody, no, you got to go back to them. You mispriced that. We'll lose money. I can't. Well, can't you make an exception here? No, we really can't. And so it really, at first they disliked me, but toward the end, it really became a partnership where they learned, look, my job isn't to say no. My job is to say yes, but I have to put the constraints around it. And so that's one example of kind of, right before the close, where we really work closely with different salespeople, is trying to make sure that we got the deal done, but we got it done at the right numbers.
Getting it done in the right way.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's a great example, Paul, because many of the folks in ops in our blog talk about being a partner with sales, but they also talk about the work that can involve and how building trust can be a long journey, a journey that involves adding value to sales and helping them see that what we're doing actually benefits themselves and the business and the sales folks. So I'm really interested on the perspective of doing that from finance. How do you get to that place? What are the key themes to get sales on side and how you've seen that work, going from that position of maybe sometimes being annoying to, in the end, like you said, being a partner?
Yeah, I think for me, there's a couple things to being a business partner. I look at FP&A and I look at one of the most important things you can do is partner with the business, whether it's sales or other areas, product, whatever it may be. And for me, where I first gained trust is by providing them stuff they needed. Like, oh, you're not getting that data. Let me make sure you're getting that report. By calling them and saying, by working with the VP and looking at the organization and saying, okay, here's the constraints we have. How can we reorganize things to free up dollars to allow you to do what you need to do? And so I really built trust by delivering on little things, making sure they really understood their budget and they were involved in the process. Because I've seen companies sometimes where finance does a budget and they don't involve the business. They're not talking to the sales operations people and they're just looking at last year and running some numbers. And so first for me, it was letting them know, look, I'm here to help you. And really making sure I was providing them stuff of value so they could trust me. And then it came to the point where, especially my last role, everybody in sales called me, to where sometimes it's like, could you go somewhere else? I don't do everything. I'm just a finance guy here. But it was great because I was really a business partner and I was trusted. I mean, when I left, I still have relationships with some of them. Like I talked to the head of sales, we're friends, right? We developed a good relationship. It wasn't just a business relationship. And I became a trusted partner for them. So when they needed something, they knew they could pick up the phone and call me. And that was built over time. It was by delivering what they needed to help them accomplish their job, whatever it might be. Like an example, we did some big proposals and we didn't have a good handle because of our data. We didn't really have a good handle of what the customer margin was. We weren't going down to customer. And I spent all the time to figure out for some of our large customers, what exactly was their margin, and help them figure out a path of how we grow that margin, how we improve these large customers we had. And nobody in the finance had done that before because it was extremely challenging due to our data limitations. And it took, several months to work through that data. It wasn't an overnight project. And that really built a high level of trust of here's someone who's willing to do whatever it takes to help us be successful.
Yeah, going for those quick wins, those shorter, smaller wins, that builds a position of trust that you can work with folks on longer term projects.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So those longer term, those big corporate objectives, that's something we discussed before, Paul, and it's a key area that you feel that ops and finance can work together on. So explain to me what some of the big ones might be, maybe ones that folks might not be aligned on already in their org.
Yeah, I mean, I think one, and again, it's going to vary a little bit by organization, but typically, finance has to sign off that the dollars make sense on a commission plan, right? And there's different levels of involvement. I actually wrote some commission plans, worked very closely with sales, but I think that's a key area where getting that alignment. And I'll give an example is, the business wanted to say, clawbacks or cancellations, something every salesperson hates, right? It's never their fault and they should never apply. I don't think almost never meet a salesperson, but yeah, you should take that money back. And, finance looks at it and says, okay, we didn't collect the revenue that we expected to collect when we paid you the amount. You know, the $100 we paid you was based on the expectation we get $1,000 of revenue, and we only got 500. So now we're upside down. And so I think that was one of the biggest areas, really working through every year as we put new quotas and new sales in place, is there was often a pretty big bridge between what sales wanted and what finance wanted. You know, first, like, well, we can't achieve that quota. Well, that's what the quota has to be to hit our financial projections. Sales guys, you know, have to be able to sell this much. But here's why we're concerned about it. So trying to work through those type of issues, trying to work through what's the appropriate clawback period on a cancellation, how much you go against the sales guy. And, you know, finding that balance between the financial numbers, incentivizing people correctly, and making sure you can hit, you know, those corporate objectives at the top line. And so those were always some pretty, you know, lengthy processes and some long, at times contentious discussions. But I always found is, you know, if we always came back to what's best for the salesperson, you know, for the customer, and try to keep those things in mind, and sometimes they conflicted, that, you know, we could always work through those and come up with something that, you know, at the end of the day was hopefully beneficial for everybody.
Yeah, okay. So you said something quite intriguing there, which is we have this number as a business that we need to hit, and it would mean that sales folks need to bring in this much revenue. How involved would finance get in some of those top of funnel metrics? Like, how many opportunities are we going to need to feed that? What's our close rate going to have to be?
Yeah, yep, great. Those are great questions, and I think it varies by business. So the first, in one of the companies I work for, the first business I supported, we really didn't look at those metrics very much. Another one I supported, we looked really closely because it was very much a business that almost all our sales were being generated by our lead generation, a lot of our sales. And so we'd look closely at how much we were spending. Like, we knew they were spending, I think it was, you know, 100, 200,000 a month in lead generation. And, you know, we're getting 5,000 leads. The close rate is 7% on those 5,000 leads. Now it's gone up to 10. And so we'd look at that pretty closely. We'd also look at it from a perspective of what percentage of the quota is coming from a warm lead versus cold calling. So are we paying people to close stuff where, you know, we're basically just giving them the customer? It's a little more order taking. And I don't want to, you know, I use that word gently because I get there's still work involved. I don't want to say, you know, it's just processing.
Yeah.
Or is it something where they've gone through and they're doing the whole process? Because you're typically going to pay differently for that. If it's something where 90% of it is automated and they're just doing, you know, final kind of signature type thing, that's one amount you're going to pay. And so we would track those pretty close and, you know, consider that in the role and how we, you know, how you thought about things for that role and what made sense from a commission standpoint.
Yeah. I love this. I love the fact finance are involved in these typically sales types things. So one thing I was interested in is how can sales leaders and people in sales ops help finance understand possible shortcomings, pitfalls, what might happen on the road ahead, rather than, oh, we didn't have that money we expected, like you were describing earlier?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is coming up front. And I'll give a great example. You talk about spiffs, right? Salespeople love to use spiffs. Like, hey, we're having this problem. Let's run an incentive. Let's incentivize everybody. And there's definitely times to use spiffs, and there's ways that they can be used that really make a difference. But, you know, the problem you run into sometimes is it's the middle of the year and, oh, hey, I want to do this spiff. And you come to finance, it's like, well, I don't have $20,000 sitting around to run that spiff. And so aligning ahead of time, like, it was really nice. I had one sales guy that came to me and they said, look, we would like a budget of, and you know, it was $5,000, $10,000 a month or whatever for spiffs. And we want it built into the plan. So we don't have to come to you every single time and say, hey, here's what we're going to do. Or, hey, can we have this money? And like, well, no, we don't have the money. You didn't tell us to budget the money. And so that was really helpful. Things like that. If you know there's things you're going to do that are going to cost money, make sure you let finance up front so they can plan for it. You know, finance may come back after and help me understand what we got for that. And that's, you know, can lead to a different discussion. But I think it's key to have done it up front and budget for those various things that are beyond the normal, you know, things you might do every day, so that it doesn't become a contentious issue on the back end of, oh no, we have to do that, we'll make money. It's like, well, we don't have the money and there's no guarantee we'll make money, and, you know, kind of becomes a point of contention instead of, something that's already been figured out ahead of time. So that's
Yeah.
always helpful when they come and really lay everything out that they're going to need, so you can figure the best path to get there ahead of time.
Yeah, nipping it in the bud, as it were. Yeah, before
Exactly.
it's a problem. Yeah, okay. So, final question for you, Paul. If you're in a room full of finance, sales ops, even sales leaders, but the best to ever do it, what would you ask them?
Whew, the best to ever do it, what would I ask them? I would want to know how they're incentivizing people, how they understand human behavior. Because at the end of the day, I think sales operations, growing a business, especially sales, it comes down to incentivizing people correctly and knowing how to tap into who they are and get the best out of them. So I'd want to know how they're doing that. How are you really getting the best out of the people and the organization? And I think that comes down to, a couple things. One, human behavior, which often a lot of human behavior is how you incentivize people. Sometimes we don't like to call it that, but that's, a lot of what it comes down to.